I organized a birthday party for my dad, but he showed up drunk with my stepmom and stepbrother, so I had security kick them out. My parents separated when I was barely 6 years old. They married young, but once the honeymoon phase ended, they started arguing a lot. Both worked overtime to pay the piling bills, along with their student loans. The year they were supposed to divorce, my mom discovered she was pregnant. For reasons beyond my understanding, they decided to give their marriage one last try. It was a huge mistake because my earliest childhood memories are of my parents shouting at each other at the top of their lungs. Every morning started like this. My mom would scold my dad for not cleaning up after himself and for not helping around the house, while my dad complained about my mom's cooking skills and how she was useless. Whether she made pancakes, toast, or waffles, he always had a problem with it because no matter what she did, he just didn't want it. He constantly compared her to his mother and said he wished he had never married her. My mom would retort that he should have married a richer woman and regretted having a child with him. This was practically every day. Sometimes I tried to block out the background noise by playing with my food, but it left a lasting impression on me, making me realize they both blamed me, even if just a little, for why they couldn't leave each other. My dad would come home late at night to avoid spending time with either me or my mom. If she complained about feeling overwhelmed with work, he'd huff and tell her his job was more important than hers. If I ever wanted to play with him, he would be fine and kind for 30 minutes, but beyond that, he'd start getting annoyed and scolding me for being too needy. I was just a kid then, but I remember him saying that so many times that now as an adult I fear coming across as needy to others. Slowly, our home life got even worse over time. My mom would spend her afternoons drinking while my dad would come home drunk from the bar and crash on the couch. They both started missing work because sometimes they didn't even wake up on time to get me ready for school. Weekends were far worse. I spent many nights hungry because my parents were too intoxicated or hungover to cook or even order takeout. It was an endless cycle of chaos and neglect. Now I understand that what my parents were doing could have landed them in jail, but at that time, there was no other adult around to protect me. My teachers sometimes talked to me and then called my parents for a chat, but since there was no evidence of physical abuse on me, no one really cared to call Child Protective Services as I grew older. I became the unofficial mediator between my parents. Every time they fought, I would try to keep the peace at home, even though I was still just a kid. I knew what my parents didn't like about each other. For example, my mom hated that my dad never picked up his socks or towels after himself, so I started doing it every day, thinking this would lead to fewer fights. I knew my dad didn't like that my mom watched TV loudly on the couch, so before he would come home every night, I would urge my mom to lower the volume. It was difficult for me as a child to keep my parents' tempers in check or distract them from their conflicts, but regardless of what I did, they ended up fighting one way or another. It was a heavy burden for me to carry as a child, and often I found myself feeling overwhelmed and defensive. I wished for a peaceful home where I could feel safe and loved, but instead, I lived in a constant state of tension and anxiety. There were times when I witnessed my parents physically fighting, and then my mom would lock herself in the bathroom for hours to protect herself. One night, their fight escalated, and my mom threw a glass bottle at my dad's face, causing him to bleed from his nose. My mom screamed at me to call 911, and while some details are fuzzy now, I remember the police questioning me about the fight. Ultimately, Child Protective Services were called, and my parents received a verbal warning that the next time it happened, I would be taken away. They pretended to be concerned in front of the officers, but I doubt they actually cared. They spoke with me after everyone left and promised they would work to become better people. However, that promise didn't last long. Despite their efforts to save their marriage, it was clear that my parents were incompatible. They had different priorities, values, and communication styles that constantly clashed. I could see the toll it was taking on both of them, as well as on me. Luckily, when I was 13, they finally decided to end their marriage once and for all. It was a relief in some ways to know the constant turmoil would eventually come to an end. But it also marked the beginning of a new chapter filled with its own challenges and adjustments. I had to divide my time between my parents' separated homes. My mom received child support from my dad and searched for a new job to support herself and me. Initially, it was really hard for her to find one, but my uncle helped her get an office job as a secretary, where she worked for several years under a kind and patient boss who paid her pretty well. I met her boss and family several times during work parties, and I am still very grateful she decided to hire my mom because it really saved our lives and helped pay for everything at home. On the other hand, my dad sank deeper into drinking like there was no tomorrow. That's why I dreaded my visits with him, because he would either be passed out from drinking or bring a strange woman home for some fun. It was extremely uncomfortable and I hated it. However, I didn't have much of a choice since I was scared of upsetting him. I noticed a pattern in his dating history: single mothers with 1 or 2 kids. My dad dated these women and quickly grew close to their children, posting their pictures all over social media and even celebrating their birthdays with them. Meanwhile, my mom had to remind him about important days in my life, like my birthday, as he sometimes completely forgot. He would always insist on me bonding with his girlfriend's kids, pushing them on me. I absolutely hated this habit of his. I mean, I understand my dad was single and free to date whoever he wanted, but he always pretended to be this responsible dad in front of other kids while neglecting his only daughter. I remember when my school organized a father-daughter dance, I had a feeling my dad would find an excuse to not attend, and as expected, he did. My mom tried to talk to him, but he kept insisting that one of his girlfriend's kitchens needed repairs. I was a bit sad, but it worked out because one of my uncles, my mom's cousin, took me to the dance and I had a wonderful time. As I grew older and my dad continued to date women, he ignored me more and more. He stopped allowing me to go to his house, telling my mom he would be out all night drinking or partying, and reasonably, my mom wouldn't argue. Things got worse when one afternoon my dad called out of the blue to ask if I was free for dinner that night. I excitedly accepted, thinking maybe he finally missed me and wanted to spend some time alone with me. Imagine my surprise when he picked me up in a fancy car, honking loudly outside our house. I ran out to see him sitting next to a blonde woman with an older boy sitting in the back. Later, during dinner, my dad introduced me to his latest girlfriend, Gina, and her son, Robin. Robin was 5 years older than me and didn't seem very excited to meet me. Gina smiled at me but kept our conversations to a minimum throughout dinner. My dad wouldn't stop bragging about how wonderful his relationship with Gina and Robin was, and how proud he was of Robin for playing soccer so well and apparently leading his entire team to victory that season. At one point, Robin even toasted to my dad, saying he had never seen his mother happier with any other man. Clearly, my dad and Gina were in love, all blushing and on top of each other. So it wasn't surprising when months later, my dad told me he was going to marry her. He invited my mom and me as guests, and we were happy to be there until I noticed that Robin was my dad's best man. My dad and he were laughing together like best friends. I felt this strange feeling of jealousy and anger, and I guess my mom must have noticed my expression because she hugged me throughout the wedding. I watched my dad celebrate with his new family as if it was his first marriage. Not once did he call me for a family photo. The only time he approached me was to ask my mom and me if we were having a good time. I felt so invisible, as if I no longer belonged in his life. As the night went on, I became quieter and quieter. I couldn't understand how my dad could be so happy and carefree while I felt my world crumbling around me. Robin seemed to slot into my dad's life effortlessly, gliding seamlessly into the role of his son. When it was time for my mom and me to leave, my dad didn't even hug me goodbye. I think that was the last time I saw my dad laughing and dancing with his new family. After that, I didn't bother reaching out to him much. That's how I realized that unless I texted or called him, he really didn't miss me. Months passed, and although he continued sending child support, he never bothered to check how we were doing. When it was time for college, I made sure of it. I had a much better job and had stopped drinking. It wasn't until months after I had already started university that I received a call from my dad. He told me how surprised he was that I was so grown up now. Well, I wasn't surprised that he hadn't noticed anything about me. He kept asking me about mundane things here and there, trying to strike up a conversation, and then he launched into a speech about how Robin had landed a good job, which coincidentally was in the same city as my university. He mentioned he would come with Gina to visit Robin and thought it would be a wonderful idea to meet up with me as well. I said that was fine, but he kept insisting, and eventually I agreed. I probably shouldn't have, but as much as I hated admitting it, I missed my dad. Regardless of his relationship with my mom, I wanted both parents to love me and treat me like their daughter. I deserved to be seen, and I hoped my dad would eventually grow up enough to see that. The night we were supposed to meet up at a cafe near my university, I was all dressed up and excited. However, hours passed, and I was alone in the cafe sipping my coffee and watching the door, but my dad never showed up. I kept calling him, but there was no answer. I told my mom, so she called him too, worried that maybe something had happened to him. 3 hours later, my dad called to inform me that he had lost track of time watching a soccer game with Robin and couldn't make it to see me that night. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach hearing him say this so casually, as if I hadn't spent the night excited to finally see him after so many months. Deep down, I could hear Gina and Robin chatting happily, so he was clearly still with them. I told him how I'd been alone in the cafe for hours, and he replied that I should have left after the first hour when he didn't show up and tried to give me his usual excuses. I was so angry that I simply hung up and blocked him. He must have called my mom, but she supported my decision, telling him how he had clearly failed as a father to me. I cried a lot that night, but by the next morning I felt sad about what had happened. I guess rage and my mom's words must have reached my dad, because when I opened my email, I was surprised to see a long email from him apologizing to me and begging me to unblock him. He wrote how he never thought his actions could affect me so much and promised he would do better. I didn't unblock him because I knew I couldn't keep doing this to my mental health. For months after that, my dad continued sending me emails wishing me happy birthday or saying hi on Christmas and holidays, but I never replied. Meanwhile, my mom would come regularly to my university and visit me whenever we both had a break. I learned to be satisfied with spending time with the only parent who truly loved me. During my junior year of college, I woke up to several missed calls from a hospital and my mom's family. When I called my relatives back, I found out my mom had had an accident and was in critical condition. I packed to go back to my hometown overnight. Fortunately, my roommate agreed to take me, so we arrived much faster than I anticipated. I remember collapsing when I saw my mom in the hospital bed with tubes connected everywhere. I recall that the doctors were trying to talk to me, but I couldn't process anything. Apparently, my mom had fallen into a coma, and there wasn't much that could be done. 3 days later, she passed away, and the doctors told me she didn't suffer much. I don't remember much about those days because everything is very fuzzy. I remember seeing my dad and simply collapsing in his arms while I cried. At that moment, I didn't care about my anger toward him. I was just grateful to have shoulders to cry on. Surprisingly, my dad stepped up and made sure my mom had a wonderful funeral. Robin and Gina did everything they could to be there for me as much as they could. My mom's relatives would regularly show up with cooked meals, making sure I ate every day. I just lay in bed, unable to move, eat, or sleep. I don't know how I survived those days, but looking back, somehow I did. When it came time to read my mom's will, she made sure all her possessions, like the house and her car, which were all paid for, went to me. Her savings account would be enough for me to finish college without worrying about taking loans. My dad also agreed to pay any additional costs if necessary, so at that moment, I had nothing to worry about. I didn't want to sell the house, so I agreed to rent it to a nice couple, and it became a source of income for me. I decided to keep the car for myself since it would help me get back and forth from my part-time job. Eventually, I went back to my university because I was missing too many classes. My dad would call and text regularly to make sure I was okay. It was very tough for me to keep living without my mom, and suddenly everything around me felt empty. My classmates helped me catch up on my assignments, and my college professors were quite understanding for the most part. During this time, I got to know Gina and Robin much better as they would come with my dad to visit me on weekends. For the first time, I felt that my dad was treating me like family since he took me to soccer games and out to dinner. At first, I didn't really notice anything negative about Gina, but over time, as I spent more time around her and my dad, I noticed how she could be a bit critical and dramatic. She would argue with my dad like a teenager and would get mad if he didn't do something exactly how she wanted. For instance, if we returned from a game and she wanted pizza while everyone else wanted burgers, she would sit sulking in the car, refusing to go in until my dad agreed to order pizza. If my dad refused or complained about how much money she spent on her nails and hair, which were a lot of dollars, she would threaten to divorce him. She also commented on the clothing choices of other girls, casually using derogatory terms. It really bothered me because, as a young woman myself, I didn't want to judge or belittle other women for their outfits. Then she would turn to me and say how she was the popular girl in her high school and how the girls today couldn't compare to her best version. It was so uncomfortable that I had to bite my tongue to keep from responding with something rude, and I just nodded. When Robin got a girlfriend, Gina became even more unpleasant. If we were ever invited to any family dinners where Robin would also bring his girlfriend, Gina would constantly ask the poor girl rude and uncomfortable questions, like how many men she had slept with and if she was using protection, because according to Gina, women were trying to trap her son Robin. It was just uncomfortable throughout all of this, and if Robin ever confronted his mom later about this behavior, she would burst into tears and complain to my dad about how she just wanted what was best and was looking out for her son. But he didn't care. This is how I knew Gina was someone I needed to avoid as much as possible. Without my dad realizing, every time he came to visit me, I would ask him if we could spend some time alone, and at first he would agree, but Gina would constantly call him and interrupt our time. Later, I found out she was tracking his phone through an app and would call to check if he was really with me or with another woman. A year passed, and when the anniversary of my mom's death came around, I was heartbroken. My dad and I had decided to spend the entire day together to visit her grave and then go out for lunch. I made it very clear to him that it was a very vulnerable day for me and that I didn't want to spend time with anyone else. However, despite my wishes, he showed up with Gina, who seemed to be on a joyride, constantly munching on fries or listening to music. At one point, when I was quietly crying because I missed my mom while looking at her pictures on my phone, Gina asked why I was still crying for my mother when it had already been a year since she passed away, emphasizing the word year as if it was ridiculous for me to still miss my own mother. This really infuriated me, but I didn't want to say anything, hoping my dad would defend me. Unfortunately, he didn't react at all. When we got to my mom's grave with the flowers I had bought, Gina refused to get out and told my dad and me that we needed to go back as soon as possible because she couldn't stand the heat. I remember thinking, what was even the point of her coming if all she was going to do was complain and not even let us pay our respects peacefully? It had barely been 5 minutes when she started calling my dad's phone, insisting we needed to wrap things up quickly. I gave up and went silently back to the car. When lunchtime arrived, Gina decided on Chinese food because it was her favorite, even though neither my dad nor I were fans. However, my dad caved as usual. Overall, the day was turning out entirely opposite to what I had anticipated. I found myself eating very little at the Chinese buffet, and Gina must have noticed because she asked if something was wrong, but I shook my head, preferring to be alone with my thoughts. However, Gina then began criticizing me as if I was ruining the vibe of the entire day. She even commented that if she ever passed away, she would never want her son Robin to be so depressed and melancholic in front of others. At that moment, I simply couldn't hold my anger any longer, and exploded with a speech about how she didn't have the right to tell me how to handle my grief when I was the one who lost my mother. I didn't stop there. I told her that if she really thought I was ruining the vibe, then she should have stayed home, because all I wanted was to spend time mourning my mom and talking with my dad. My dad and Gina looked surprised by my outburst, and I felt embarrassed by it all, so I left the restaurant to clear my head. Later, my dad came back with a solemn expression and told me that while he understood my perspective, I should be more considerate of his wife, who had sacrificed her entire day to be there with me. Questioning why he brought her when I had asked to spend the day alone with him, my dad replied that Gina thought I was becoming too dependent, and as an adult daughter, I shouldn't spend so much time alone with him. I almost had tears rolling down my cheeks hearing those words, as they reminded me of my childhood when my dad would get angry if I needed more of his attention and scolded me for being needy. I'm not sure if I was truly being needy or clingy that day, but I knew I missed my mom even more because she would never have made me feel bad for crying. The journey home was silent, and Gina refused to speak with me despite my attempts to apologize. Days later, my dad told me how Gina was still upset with me for my behavior and asked if I could go to her house and properly apologize to her during dinner, since this was basically my fault. He said that he and Gina had been fighting continuously because I had embarrassed her publicly. Rage washed over me at this suggestion, and I firmly refused, insisting that Gina's reactions were immature. I maintained that I had already extended my apologies during the car ride home and told him that if he persisted with such theatrics, I no longer wanted anything to do with it. Despite my dad's efforts to convince me, I remained firm in my decision. From that day on, my relationship with Gina never improved. I don't know what she told Robin, but he also refused to talk to me after that. Dad was the only one who sometimes came to visit me on several occasions, like during my college graduation or when I got my first job. He begged me over and over to apologize to Gina, saying how we could be a normal family again, but I never listened. Over the years, Gina and I had continued avoiding each other unless absolutely necessary, and we ignored each other as much as possible if we were in the same room. The pain of losing my mom still hurts, but I'm a grown woman now and know how to handle my emotions better. Eventually, I sold my mom's house after graduating and bought a small condo for myself in the city where I currently work. I've kept in touch with my mom's relatives as much as I could. Also, I've been dating my boyfriend Harry, and we are really happy together. My dad has met him several times and they get along with golf and football. Everything in my life had been going well until this recent incident. My dad was about to turn 50, and since it was such a significant milestone, I wanted to throw him a birthday party. Weeks before his birthday, I asked if he was okay with that, and he was more than happy, telling me how he wanted to bring Gina and Robin and how he hoped this birthday party could help mend the relationship between all of us. I hesitated but didn't want to argue with him again, so I told him that since so many years had passed, I was open to them, and Gina was too. Besides, it was his party, so he could invite whoever he wanted. I organized and paid for everything for my dad's party at an expensive restaurant, so all my dad and his family had to do was show up in their best outfits. That afternoon, Harry and I were the first to arrive at the venue, while my dad, Gina, and Robin arrived an hour later. I called my dad several times, but he didn't answer, so I already knew something was off. When my dad entered, I immediately noticed he had been drinking since he could hardly walk straight without Robin's help. My dad gave me a big smile and hugged me. Gina didn't even acknowledge me and went straight to hug my boyfriend, who looked uncomfortable. Robin gave me a nod and helped my dad sit at the table. I asked what had happened, and Robin told me my dad had decided to get drunk before coming because he wanted to start his birthday rather early. I shook my head because I had grown up seeing my dad get drunk every night, and I knew how embarrassing it could be. Gina laughed at my expression and loudly said I should relax because my dad was just having fun. My eyes narrowed upon hearing her words because it was a rather expensive restaurant, and if my dad started acting embarrassingly like he usually did when drunk, they could kick us out. When the waiter came with our main dishes, my dad seemed completely out of place and couldn't even hold his fork correctly. Harry and I just tried to focus on our food while Gina and Robin kept laughing and pointing at my dad. When they served the wine, my dad kept drinking, which was making him even more wasted, even though I kept telling him to stop. Suddenly, my dad got up from his chair and loudly announced he wanted to make a toast reluctantly. I lifted my glass as he began to say how grateful he was to be turning 50, surrounded by his wonderful family, and how lucky he felt to have Gina and Robin in his life. My heart sank as he continued saying that the best decision of his life was divorcing his previous wife, my mom, because that woman drove him crazy. Gina laughed at this while I glared at my dad in fury. He carried on, saying that meeting Gina and marrying her saved his life because before them, his life was empty. Meanwhile, Gina and Robin were still smiling and cheering him on as if it was acceptable to say this in front of me. As if that wasn't enough, my dad then directed his attention toward me, still saying that his biggest mistake in life was marrying my mom since he got stuck with her all those years when she got pregnant with me. Then he laughed and joked loudly if he could leave it tonight to celebrate his birthday with his real family, because he wanted the next chapter in his life to be free from past mistakes. Hearing this, Robin and Gina began laughing out loud as if it were the funniest joke ever. I took a deep breath and knew I couldn't take this any longer, so I called the waiter and asked him to call security. The waiter didn't hesitate since my dad's loud words could be heard all over the restaurant, and in a matter of minutes, 2 security guards appeared at our table, their presence causing a stir among other diners. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're going to have to ask you to leave," said one of the guards firmly, pointing toward the exit. My dad's face turned red with embarrassment as he realized what was happening. He stammered in protest, begging me to stop them, but I stood my ground, gazing firmly into his eyes. Gina started shouting that I was embarrassing my dad in front of everyone and that he was just having fun on his birthday. I didn't care, and neither did the security guards, so my dad was escorted out along with Robin and Gina, who kept screaming at me angrily. Later, I was overwhelmed with emotions and apologized to all the diners and staff after dinner, leaving them a generous tip. Since that dinner, I have been bombarded with text messages from Gina and Robin calling me names and saying how I ruined the atmosphere and that I should have just left if I didn't want to feel embarrassed by my dad's behavior. My dad has tried contacting me several times, but I have refused to answer. That's why I'm on Reddit to ask if I'm the only one who acted wrong by kicking my dad out after he said all those hurtful things in front of me. Update 1. Wow, how this post has blown up in just a few hours. I get it, guys. I did the right thing by kicking my dad out. I didn't expect hundreds of commenters to support me, although I appreciate all of you supporting my decision. I still don't want any of you to write really bad things about my dad. Despite how wrong he is, he's still my dad, and I just came to Reddit to understand if my actions were right or wrong. I can see I have my answer for now. Update 2. It's been several weeks since my last update, and for those wondering, my dad hasn't contacted me anymore. Gina and Robin have also stopped messaging me. It was only today that I found out my post had gone viral, and Robin might have recognized my story, so he sent the link of my post to my dad. I guess my dad might have read the comments and seen how many people think he and Gina are jerks. I don't know how our relationship will unfold in the future, but for now, I'm not ready to forgive him. Update 3. I'm back after 3 weeks, and I'm doing so to tell you that my dad has contacted me again. This will be a bit longer than my previous updates, so please be patient. He called my house the other day. I had him blocked on my cell phone, so I don't know where he got my number, but he managed it. Harry answered it, so when he figured out who it was, he silently asked me if I wanted him to say I was out or that I wasn't home. So I took the time to think it over. I eventually agreed to talk to him. I knew nothing good would come of it, but it was better to have one last conversation and close this out. So, I said, hello, and we started talking, first about trivial things where he asked how I was and stuff like that, but then he came to what he really wanted to say. He said he was still very embarrassed and that Gina and Robin were even more so, that he thought I was a good girl, which is why he was going to do the right thing and apologize to everyone because, in the end, it was his birthday, and it should have been a nice night for him. Meanwhile, I listened attentively, not wanting to miss anything he said because, of course, my response would come after. So when he seemed to finish, because he didn't have any more words to make himself look like a victim, it was my turn. I told him I had planned that night for us to spend time together, but he ruined it by showing up drunk with his family. Plus, he said many hurtful things about someone who had been very important in my life, and that, although things had ended badly between them, that doesn't mean he could say everything he said. Then I told him I wasn't sorry for anything I said or did because he certainly deserved that and even more. But he has never, in his whole life, been able to see his flaws. That's why he continues finding excuses in other people instead of himself. He's an alcoholic because he can't control himself with drinking, and he's chosen a bad woman. Lastly, I told him not to ever call me again or show up at my house, especially if Gina ever does something to cheat on him because he would no longer have a daughter to count on. To me, my parents are already dead. With that, I hung up the call, and I haven't heard from him since. Maybe everything I said sounded a bit harsh, but I think it was necessary to sever all ties with him. I believe therapy could help me, so I'm going to look for a professional to deal with all these issues, including the loss of my mother. Update 4. Hi guys, it's been almost 7 months since my last update. I can't believe how much my life has improved since then. First of all, I joined therapy, where I was able to release years and years of my childhood trauma. Now I understand why people feel lighter after going to therapy. Because of this, I decided to permanently cut off my dad and his family without explanation. I'm doing very well in my life, and I'm lucky to have a wonderful boyfriend like Harry, who understands and takes care of me. I hope this can be my last update here since I've moved on with my life.